Hi superstars, we're going to talk about how to get your point across in debating. In this little video, we're going to talk about how to write a point and the elements you need to create that point. Let's get started. Before we jump into the elements of a point in debating, we're going to talk about logic because that's the foundation of argumentation in debating. So looking down at our definition, logic is a method of reasoning that involves a series of statements, each of which must be true if the statement before it is true. So each must be true if the statement before it is true. So this is about presenting your ideas in a structured way. So it's a confusing thing to start with. So there's a bit of an analogy that I've thought of, which is imagine you're building a brick house. So each of these bricks is an idea. So you can imagine this as a singular statement. It's one statement that you make. And as you go, you create these series of statements. And each of those are built upon that first brick you made, that first statement you made, you put down. So you need to be foundational in how you write and in how you persuade people. As you go forward, you'll start to create something that resembles, a point or a case, and you can see it take shape. And then finally, we have our house, right? We have our final point, our final case. And your listener, your audience is really able to understand what you were trying to achieve. So you can imagine it being, this is just your initial idea. And then this is sort of your final point on a whole, right? So you can imagine these being your sentences. And then as you move forward, obviously it goes up in its length and complexity. You start to have more sentences, more ideas, until we reach our final point, which really is just the paragraph slash paragraphs, right? So logic is just about building up reasoning and progressively getting more complex for your audience. And we're doing this to try to prove our points. So there are 4 steps in writing a point. You can imagine this being sort of like our teal structure at school, but it's a little bit more fluid, right? It's a spoken text. It doesn't have to be perfect. Likewise, I want you to feel like you can be creative. Don't feel like you have to stick to following these sequentially. Mess around with it. Have some fun. Introduce your own personality. However, we'll just talk about the basics to start with. So the first thing you need to do is introduce your argument. And that's really one sentence that states what you're trying to prove. So what is your point? The second thing is you need to explain that logic. So start building up your sentences behind your arguments. Now there's 2 approaches. You can follow the brute force approach, which is throwing as many bricks as your opposition as possible. Not literally, of course, but it's about providing a lot of ideas. It's kind of overwhelming the opposition. Whereas you have the narrative approach, which is a bit more methodical. It's where you're sort of following one line or one person or one idea, and you're running with that one. That's a bit more advanced, but it's something that especially people who are creative writers can definitely try and attempt to write. The third thing you need to do is give some evidence or examples to support your logic. So you've just spent all this time providing your audience and the opposition with a series of ideas. Well, what do your ideas look like in practice? Do you have a hypothetical? Do you have a real world example that you could use to illustrate that logic, to make it really clear? And the fourth thing you need to do is link the argument you've made back to the topic. So this is where you need to tell me, why should we care? Why should your audience care about what you've said, and how does it relate to the topic on a whole? Okay, this is an example of a point. So this is the first aspect. This topic that we're going to look at is a real example from a student, and the topic was that children should not be allowed to have their own YouTube channel. Please be aware that some of the writing isn't perfect, but that's fine. Because remember, debating is about speaking, not about writing. No one will ever mark you on your grammar, punctuation, and spelling in debating. It's all about how you speak it, how you present it. So let's have a read. So ladies and gentlemen, for my first point tonight, I will be arguing that children should have freedom of choice when it comes to using creative communities. Freedom of choice is defined as allowing people to choose what they want to do. So we can see here they're setting up their point. One thing I want you to take note of that's incredibly crucial in debating is that you need to say very explicitly my first point. You need to do this thing called signposting. So signposting is where you tell your audience what you're doing. And you need to do this throughout your speech. My first point is, now I will be moving on to my second point. My second point is, to conclude my speech, right? You need to make sure your audience is really aware of where you are in your speech, okay? So you can see, really basic way, introducing your point should be just 1 or 2 sentences, and then you get into the logic. Now, this is the logic part of the point. So freedom of choice is defined as allowing people to choose what they want to do. In regards to YouTube, children can have their own channel at just the age of 13 under YouTube's current policy. When children reach this age, they are in high school and are being given more responsibility and independence. Generally, most know that by putting themselves on YouTube, they're opening themselves up to criticism from people they may not know. We know this because we hear about horror stories and watch the news. The horror stories are just that, incredibly rare experiences that we see on 60 Minutes or hear from a friend of a friend. Young people also have a variety of social media already at their disposal, and it would be impossible to stop. Once a child is 13, they should be responsible enough to make their own decision. Even if parents are concerned, they can have conversations with their children so they know what they're getting themselves into. Then the parents can discuss with the child the problems associated with YouTube. So you can see the series of bricks, right? Defining what freedom of choice is. Logical brick. Now, this says children can have their channel at the age of 13. When they reach this age, they're in high school and are being given more responsibility. So we're getting some logic, some statements being made that relate to the previous sentence. And this builds up your case. This builds up your point and proves you're right. Okay, so these bricks are really important. Most know that putting themselves on YouTube, opening themselves up for criticism. Okay, so building until we kind of come to the end, right? So we're almost there. We're going to move on to our evidence next. So this evidence is more of a real world example. So let's start reading. In addition, the platform of YouTube already has safety measures in place to protect children from harmful content. This is called YouTube Kids. YouTube also blocks inappropriate videos such as sexual content, extreme violence, and other immoral content. Many people have reached stardom from YouTube. Many young people also explore their creativity through the platform too. If a child decides that they want to have a YouTube channel, then the parents should allow them to in this safe environment. So you can see here, this is more of an example or evidence of a real world thing happening. Talking about YouTube Kids, talking about what YouTube does already in practice to prove our logic, right? To kind of prove and support what we've stated. So this is the final part of your point. This is where you're making a summary, concluding what you're saying. So stopping children from accessing YouTube teaches them no lesson about how to care for their online presence in an ever-evolving online world, and it takes away their freedom as budding creatives. So this is linking a bit back to the topic at hand, that children should not be allowed to have their own YouTube channel. It links together what has been stated, right? I'm talking about the freedom of choice, talking about how YouTube already blocks things, and how parents should really be teaching their children rather than just controlling them. Okay, so it's linking it together. That concludes this video about how to write a point. Your job now is to write your own. Make sure when you're writing, you're considering those 4 elements of a point. Use that as a checklist to help you see if you've done the right thing, if you've made sure you've put in the right elements. So if you want to read the entire point, I'll put it up on the screen in a moment. Please email me your points so I can check them over. If you have any additional questions, please email me. I look forward to reading all your things. Thanks, superstars. Have a good one.